Hi, I'm some guy with an unkempt beard. Let's talk about unions in Australia. So, union membership has been falling constantly since 1976, from 52% then to 16% today. That's pretty bad, right? So why is this happening? Is it because of the stupid kids these days not joining up, as some handsome boys would say?
We still have somewhat strong unions, and this generation, because only 5% of them are signing up, that will be eroded.
Well, no, not at all, really. What's really happened is that some of the biggest unions colluded with the Labour Party to screw workers over for the benefit of big business. Together, they greatly eroded the power of organised labour and left the door wide open for the Liberal Party to finish the job. What we have as a result is a highly oppressive industrial relations system, where workers have essentially no right to take any action without the express permission of the government. And believe it or not, Australia actually violates so many provisions of international labour law that even the USA affords workers more freedom to take industrial action. And the worst part is, some of the biggest unions have a vested interest in maintaining this system as it is, so pretty much no one is actually on the side of the workers. No wonder people aren't joining up, hey?
The Labour Party unions, good. The Labour Party unions, good.
Yeah, calm down, I agree. Unions are good, at least in theory, and the Labour Party is about 100 times better than the Liberal Party. I'm not approaching this from the standpoint of, say, some baby boomer Liberal voter who thinks that the workers are oppressing the poor business owners because they want minimum wage. No. In reality, I'm extremely pro-organised labour, and if I had my way, there would be no bosses. I want unions in this country to serve the interests of workers much better than they do now. And the first step towards that goal is to raise awareness of their problems and how those problems came about. So let's do it. First, what is a union? Well, the relationship between a worker and an employer involves a heavy power imbalance in favour of the employer. The worker relies on income from their job for their very survival. For them, the stakes are huge. If they lose it, or get their pay cut, or get their hours cut, or a myriad of other things, it could potentially ruin their life. For the company, however, losing or firing a worker is just a minor inconvenience. Since unemployed workers are desperate for a job because they kind of need it to be able to afford to live, it's generally pretty easy for bosses to find a replacement. And even if they do have some trouble, the effect on the company of getting rid of a worker, worsening their conditions, etc., is never going to be anything remotely close to what the average consequences for a worker are. So, an individual worker is quite powerless. But if all the workers get together and organise, suddenly the dynamic shifts and they have power. They can make demands and take actions without having to worry nearly as much about the repercussions, because firing or reprimanding the entire workforce would actually cause huge issues for the company and possibly even just plain destroy it. This sort of organisation can take place at the level of individual workplaces or corporations or across entire industries. So that's the crux of what unions are: workers organising together autonomously to protect and further their collective interests as much as they possibly can. But when you add other groups into this mix, like governments or political parties who are also out to get the best deal for themselves, then that whole dynamic just kind of gets screwed. And we're about to see how, by going on a journey through history. Back in the 19th century, when unions wanted something, they called an impromptu strike and they just kind of got it, basically. They were really powerful, at least when the government didn't step in. Of course, I'm generalising quite a bit, and there's also the fact that they were extremely racist and wanted to deport all the non-white immigrants, but that's a story for another time. Organised labour being so powerful was a huge problem for employers. It was heavily cutting into their profits, and as you might expect, the government started stepping in to help out the bosses, both through legislation and by sending in the police and the military against striking workers on numerous occasions. The unions then decided that, since the government was being used to suppress them, they'd have to get elected themselves and change it from within. The unions in New South Wales summed it up like so: the time has come when trade unionists must use the parliamentary machine that in the past has been used against them. And that, my children, is how the Labour Party was born. Soon after, once Australia became Australia with the Act of Federation, the various state Labour parties were quite influential and formed a significant part of Australia's early parliaments. They were made up largely, though not entirely, of unionists. You can see this clearly in the first two Labour Prime Ministers. Both Chris Watson and Andrew Fisher were working class men who had joined unions, become accomplished activists, and then ended up getting into politics through the Labour Party. Quite the Cinderella stories. Aside from Labour, the other two major parties at the time were the Protectionist Party and the Free Trade Party, who would later merge together to become the good old Liberal Party that we know and hate today. Apart from the passing of the White Australia policy, which I'm going to ignore in this video because I'm Australian and a core part of that is pretending that racism does not exist. All these parties also agreed on the introduction of the Commonwealth Conciliation and Arbitration Act of 1904. This made law something called compulsory arbitration, where industrial relations disputes must be settled before a court. The court also had the power to pass laws that mandated wages and conditions in different industries. While Labor saw compulsory arbitration as a way to protect workers from the state violence that was used against them in the previous decades, the other parties saw it as a way to bring the workers under control. And when you look at the content of the Act with the benefit of hindsight, you can kind of see that it was a lot more suited towards the latter than the former. Strikes were made illegal, for example, so the principal way through which workers can exert power in the workplace was simply criminalised. There were fines for the first offence, and repeat offenders could be jailed. At first, this worked quite well for workers, but in the 1920s, the Conservative government of Stanley Bruce had enough of that, and they made ample use of the hegemonic powers of the court to attack workers' wages and conditions. They appointed their own Conservative judges and pushed the idea that Australia's economic growth was being hampered by those damn overpaid labourers. You know, give up your wages for the sake of Mr. Jobson growth. So the court started taking the broader economy into account in its decisions. Basically, if the government said that you couldn't be paid more because it wouldn't benefit the overall economy, which as we all know actually means benefit corporations, you were shit out of luck. And because industrial action was banned outside of the arbitration system, you had no other legal way to try and get your conditions improved. Cool. Back then though, the court actually needed to entice the unions to participate in order for it to have any power at all, so it couldn't go too far with its rulings. Sure, there were all of these laws against strikes and stuff, but it's pretty difficult to enforce such laws against tens of thousands of striking workers without employing terrible violence. And even conservative governments wanted to avoid such violence. So even in the face of such an oppressive system, the workers, insufficient numbers, were still able to strike occasionally and exert at least some degree of power, much to the chagrin, I hope I pronounced that correctly, of the government, the bosses, and the precursors of the Murdoch Papers. And that was mostly how things remained up until the late 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Then the leadership of unions fundamentally changed. They had, for the previous 80 years or so, been led by workers who had risen up through the union's ranks to advocate for the interests of their peers. But now, these worker activists were being replaced with university-trained bureaucrats, many of whom had undertaken industrial relations courses that specifically deal with navigating the official compulsory arbitration system. So rather than utilising the full extent of the power of the workers, they began to operate exclusively from within the very business-biased official system. And why wouldn't they? It was what they knew. They'd never actually worked in the relevant industries, so for them, unionism was more like a day job than something they were personally invested in, like the worker union bosses had been. Additionally, since they were trained specifically in navigating the compulsory arbitration system, and that training was what was getting them their paycheck, they had little reason to challenge it. In fact, they had plenty of incentive to actively try and maintain it. So, in 1983, in comes Bob Hawke as the new Labor PM in the midst of a pretty bad economic situation. Hawke was himself one of the aforementioned new breed of non-worker union leaders. He studied industrial arbitration at university and served as the president of the ACTU from 1969 to 1980. His government quickly made it clear that it would be the workers who would have to make sacrifices in the name of economic growth. He took the side of business, who held that the economic stagnation was caused by excessive wages and that the unions were too militant. So the solution to this was to be so-called structural adjustments, also known as neoliberalism, with a side of more repression of industrial action. Yep, that's right. The super cool former PM who all the young people seem to love because he chugs beer is kind of the guy who brought neoliberalism to Australia. Damn. The unions, who were represented by the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the biggest confederation of unions that at the time had around 300 member unions, signed an agreement with Hawke known as the Accord. This new generation of union bosses agreed not to contest wage cuts and not to take industrial action, while Hawke and the business sector got the economy in order. This was sold to workers with the idea that the economy would boom as a result, and the benefits would trickle back down to them. So it was another visit from Mr. Jobson growth. Of course, that didn't happen. Only businesses benefited. And that was by design, because many of these policies were the ones that were directly advocated for by business organisations. Fun side note, the ACTU completely whitewashes all of this on their website. They present the Accords as some sort of big win for workers. Super. The union bureaucrats who enthusiastically hopped on board with all of this were rewarded by being put in charge of the new, privately owned, multi-billion-dollar superannuation system, which was, and still is, full of six-figure salary executive positions that they could eventually appoint themselves or their mates to. There was dissent to all of this, most notably from the BLF union, the Building Labourers Federation, which was the predecessor to today's CFMMEU. Yes, there are apparently two M's in there now. Doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. Anyway, the Hawke government took the extraordinary decision to deregister the BLF, which essentially means they were banned. He claimed that it was due to corruption, but everyone knew that it was really a political move. They were one of the only unions unwilling to cave into business interests, and they were known for their uncompromising strikes. Two things incompatible with the neoliberal project. There were more accords passed over the years, 7 to be exact, each one making things progressively better for business, worse for workers, and eroding the power of unions. They continued in 1991, when Paul Keating replaced Hawke as PM. Keating ended up being even more pro-business than his predecessor. Unions who attempted strikes in defiance of the Accords were ostracised by the ACTU leadership and forced to participate in the system whether they liked it or not. So, strikes became very rare, though there were exceptions. A notable one is the 1986 nurses' strike, where more than 20,000 nurses walked off the job. But this strike was actually organised by the rank-and-file workers themselves, without the union leadership's approval, and the ACTU denounced the strikers. Great work advocacy there, guys. The 300 unions mentioned earlier were consolidated down to 46, making them much easier to control. Outside of the first year or two, there was next to no industrial action taken. The Accords had done their job of removing worker power and pacifying the unions perfectly, with the ACTU enthusiastically on board every step of the way. So this whole sort of thing where the government sits down with the unions and business leaders for the so-called greater good has a name, by the way. Corporatism. You might have heard of it. These are the guys who popularized it. Anyway, as you probably guessed, the promises of neoliberalism never came to fruition. And John Dawkins, who was a prominent minister in both the Hawke and the Keating governments, came out and openly admitted in 1994 that the ACTU was converted to the central element of Labour's pro-business agenda, and that it was used as a tool to engage the union movement in support of this. Unsurprisingly, after all of that, a poll in 1989 showed that most union members felt that the ACTU leadership had lost touch with the concerns of their rank-and-file members. By 1996, 57% of the workforce felt that unions no longer looked after the interests of workers, which is, the entire reason they exist. In 1983, 52% of Australian workers were union members. In 1996, this was already down to 32%. Economists have said that the Accords directly caused this decline. So the leadership of the ACTU and the Labor Party in just 13 years absolutely gutted Australia's organised labour movement, doing what even the oppressive laws of the 80 years prior had failed to do. Then 1996 comes along. DJ John Howard is elected, and thanks to all the work his predecessors did, the situation was pretty much perfect for him to deal the death blow. Howard was against the corporatist system, but not in a good way. He opposed it because even though it clearly greatly favoured business, he thought it didn't favour them enough. So previously, unions weren't striking because the leadership had agreed not to do so in the Accords. However, now that Howard was removing their seat at the table, union bosses suddenly remembered that they're kind of supposed to take industrial action rather than just do whatever the government and businesses tell them to do. Convenient. So, Howard sought to curtail this by attacking what little power unions had left. He managed to greatly restrict their powers of workplace entry and did just about everything that he possibly could to discourage workers from joining unions. Yes, even more than the unions themselves had already done. The unions were no longer equipped to effectively resist this. Their membership was greatly reduced thanks to the Accords, and their complacent bureaucratic leadership might have known industrial arbitration laws like the back of their hand, but they had absolutely no idea how to actually utilise the power of the workers and organise impactful strikes without the approval of an arbitration court. The only thing that was stopping Howard from doing much worse was that he did not control the Senate. But even without the Senate, he still managed to mess things up really bad. So much so that in 2000, the International Labour Organization condemned his government for violating all kinds of international laws on worker and union rights. Quite an achievement, little Johnny. So fast forward to 2004. Now, union membership is down to only 24%, and Howard and the Liberals win a Senate majority against Mark Latham's Labour Party. Man, it's really weird to say the words Mark Latham's Labour Party together when he's since become an absolutely bonkers far-right conspiracy theorist, but yeah, that really happened.
This neo-Marxist garbage, that's what's being taught.
Anyway, with that Senate majority, Howard rushed through his work choices legislation in 2005. This legislation further stifled union power, interfered in union affairs, discouraged union affiliation even further, and most importantly, limited the right to strike more than ever before. And as noted earlier, the right to strike was already heavily restricted, so that's saying something. Then 2007 came, and little Johnny was finally outed by Kevin 07, by far the worst James Bond in history. People were kind of excited about Kevin Rudd, because he had promised to repeal work choices. And he did, but he replaced it with the Fair Work Act in 2009. This set the rules for industrial relations going forward and established the Fair Work Commission and Ombudsman, which are basically just nicer sounding rebrands of the arbitration system that we've had since 1904. This is the system that Australia still has today. While the Fair Work Act is much better than work choices, it still unfortunately kept pretty much all of Howard's restrictions on the right to pursue lawful industrial action. To illustrate just how repressive this is, here's the checklist for when workers actually can strike in Australia. First, they must not have a current enterprise agreement. Those are the contracts agreed between workers and employers on their pay and conditions. That means that if you have an enterprise agreement, you cannot strike for the next 3 years under any circumstances until the agreement expires. If your enterprise agreement has expired though, you have to negotiate with the employer and prove that you are genuinely trying to reach an agreement. And whether you meet that very vague criteria is decided by the Fair Work Commission, which is usually stacked with government shills. If, by the grace of Marx, the Fair Work Commission actually approves your request to strike, then you must give your employer at least 3 days notice of your intent to strike. So, let's say you've gotten this far. You can finally strike, right? Nope, not that simple. Your employer has tons of recourse to stop you. If the strike will cause significant economic harm to the employer, which is, kind of the point of striking in the first place, they can ask the Fair Work Commission to forcibly suspend it. They can retaliate before the workers get the chance to strike by locking them out and employing temporary strike breakers, without having to go to the Fair Work Commission or give the workers any notice. And they can go to the Fair Work Commission and contest the strike, and the Fair Work Commission can literally order the workers to return to work. Sounds a bit like slavery, huh? And it's not even just the employer. The state or federal government can also intervene and get the strike outlawed if they think that it would have an adverse effect on the economy. This actually happened just last year, when train drivers in New South Wales were denied the right to strike because the state government's argument that it wouldn't be good for the economy was accepted by the Fair Work Commission. On top of all of that, political strikes and cross-industry strikes are explicitly illegal. So no matter how bad our government gets, or how badly workers in other industries are being mistreated, workers aren't allowed to do anything about it. This de facto suppresses general strikes too. The general strike is one of the most powerful tools at the disposal of organised workers' movements to force the government to enact real, meaningful change, and sometimes even bring them down. So is it really any wonder that they'd make them illegal? So what happens if you ignore all of this bullshit that's clearly designed to make it nearly impossible to strike, and go on strike anyway? Well, the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union, commonly known as the CFMEU, even though they're now the CFMMEU, are one of the few unions remaining that actually try to fight back against this crap. They've participated in unauthorized strikes numerous times, such as in 2014, where they illegally striked in support of a dismissed workmate. What happened? Well, they were fined $1.5 million for it. That's not even remotely their first rodeo either. They get pegged with 6-figure fines practically every few months, and good on them too. Let's contrast that with a fine against the construction corporation Grocon after their negligence resulted in a wall collapse that killed 3 people. In Australia, going on strike is a much more severe offence than industrial manslaughter. There's also the thing where attending protests can also be considered illegal industrial action, meaning workers can be fined just for protesting. Cool. So moving on, the Fair Work Act is still centred around the industrial arbitration system, which, as history showed us earlier, kind of just innately favours business. And while the Fair Work Commission is nominally independent, it's run by people who are politically appointed. This has allowed the Liberal government to stack it with their mates and ensure that it does what they want. And it would be naive to think that Labor is not going to do the same thing in the future as well. It's also resulted in the prominence of so-called bosses unions. These are unions that look like they're for workers on the surface, but they are actually geared towards negotiating agreements that are favourable to the businesses they truly represent. An illustrative example of this is the SDA. which is Australia's biggest retail and fast food union. If you've ever worked at Coles or Woolworths, you've probably been asked to join them. They are well known for their direct associations with big business and for negotiating dodgy deals that worsen the pay and conditions of their members. That unions like the SDA even exist really shows just how much of a stranglehold businesses have over the compulsory arbitration system. In many cases, business interests are being represented on all sides of the bargaining table. Despite the fact that the Fair Work Act kept all of Howard's heavy restrictions on the right to strike, the ACTU unanimously approved of it, singing its praises at every possible turn and not saying a single thing about it in a fact sheet that they released after its passing. And really, after all of this, I think the reason for that is pretty clear. Australian unions aren't unions. Sure, there are some exceptions, but most of the most influential unions in Australia simply aren't what labour unions are actually supposed to be, which is workers organising together to further their own interests. Rather, they're organisations of trained bureaucrats that are ostensibly supposed to advocate on behalf of the workers. That is a huge difference. And in practice, things are even worse because unions are actually headed by people whose interests are just fundamentally not the same as the workers. They have a direct stake in maintaining the system as it is, and they have their own allegiances to political parties, to governments, and sometimes even directly to businesses. These allegiances greatly affect the directions in which they try to move their unions and make them very selective in who they criticise and how they criticise them. We've seen this happen time and time again since the 80s, and it's going to keep happening as long as these organisations, as they are now, remain the representatives of the workers. Now sure, they definitely do throw some benefits the workers' way every now and again, but all in all, they don't do anywhere near as much as an authentic workers' union, such as those of the early 20th century for example, can do. If you want more examples of the union's investment in maintaining the current system, just take a look at the so-called Change the Rules campaign's website. Led by the ACTU, this campaign is marketed as if it's geared towards fundamentally changing the system. Sure, they're advocating for things like wage increases, increased public spending, and against the bias of the Fair Work Commission, which are good. But there's little to nothing there about fundamentally changing the innately pro-business compulsory arbitration system, nor about ending the ridiculous restrictions on industrial action that so grossly prevent workers from exercising any real power. And speaking of the ACTU, since the 80s, they've pretty much become little more than a vehicle to legitimise Labour Party policy. By presenting themselves as the voice of the workers and rarely criticising Labour on industrial relations, they help Labour retain its image as some sort of authentic workers' party when it really hasn't been anything of the sort for a very, very long time. That's another thing. The Labour Party is not a Labour Party. So this one's kind of obvious just looking at how Labour has governed during the modern era, which I kind of showed in this video. Despite the name, they're just not really a workers' party anymore. They're beholden to plenty of conflicting interests, and whenever the interests of the workers come up against those of the businesses, they just take the businesses' side way more than they do the workers. Yeah, it's true that Bill Shorten has taken on some somewhat leftish rhetoric while in opposition, but with Labour's recent history and his own, you might not know this, but Bill Shorten was a right-wing bureaucrat at the National Union of Workers, and he was well known for negotiating shoddy deals that always happened to favour the business instead of the workers. We have little reason to believe that Labour is going to do anything more than just give the workers some goodies here and there to keep them pacified. Okay, so there you have it. All of that is the real reason why people aren't joining unions anymore. Basically, because they suck now. And they don't just suck because of the Liberal Party. It's really been a team effort, and Labour and the unions themselves have contributed a whole lot to it as well. So, what do we do about all of this? Well, I'm glad you asked. Plan A is for everyone watching this video, yes, that includes you, to join me on a trip to the sunny paradise of London, England. There, we'll use our strength in numbers to appropriate the corpse of my father, the great Carlos Marx. We'll bring him back with us to Trades Hall in Melbourne, where I will lead a communist resurrection ritual. His mere presence in the country will cause revolutionary fervour, ushering in a golden age of worker dominance. He'll also, of course, make being gay mandatory, because that is a core part of Marxism, definitely. But I mean, if that's impractical, I guess we can go with Plan B instead. First, vote in the coming federal election. Vote for whoever you want, just make sure that your preferences will flow to the Greens and Labour before they go to the Liberals, or any of the many minor, crank conservative parties or independents, and there are a lot of them, so make sure you look out for them. As much as Labour suck, their greatest strength is, and always will be, that they are just not the Liberal Party. It's looking almost certain that Labour and the Greens are going to have a resounding majority in the House of Representatives, and maybe even the Senate, for the first time in what feels like absolutely forever. This is a great chance for us to do everything that we possibly can to pressure them to truly change the rules, which means changing the system to actually give workers some power back. I mean, it probably won't happen because Labour sucks and never does the things that people actually want once they're in government, but we can't really do much else, can we? A big way to exert this sort of pressure, despite all of what I've said here, is still to join a union. But hopefully not one of the big unions that are really invested in upholding the system, or maintaining their clientelist relationship with the Labour Party. You should instead join one of the smaller ones that are actually run by workers rather than on behalf of the workers, the ones that aren't super invested in the industrial relations system. That or the few bigger ones that take no shit. The CFMEU is an obvious one, if you're in the industries they cover. If every union took as much real action as they did, there'd be no way for the government to enforce its oppressive anti-strike laws, and Australia would be a much better place for workers. If you're in retail or fast food, you should never ever join the SDA, and instead join the new Retail and Fast Food Workers Union. They were created specifically to challenge the pro-business agenda of the SDA, and in just 2 years they have some great achievements to their name. They're also run by people who have actually worked in the industries in question, so that's great. Now that's just the two off the top of my head. There are more, make sure to do your research. These kind of unions are the ones that are going to actually be interested in pushing for proper systemic change rather than just band-aids. But if they're going to have any chance of being able to do it, they need members. If you really have no other option though, you might as well join a crappy union. Just make sure that you will actually be better off first, because sometimes you aren't. Always keep in mind that they are not really out for your interests, and do whatever you can to push them towards actually advocating uncompromisingly for the interests of workers. Which is kind of what they're supposed to do, they just don't. Maybe you could even make friends with other members and break off and make your own union that doesn't blow. We can dream. But hey, knowledge is power and all that blah blah blah. So now you know that Aussie unions suck if you didn't already. Do with this information what you will, or you can also just disregard it and keep watching overconfident, sexy models who are being paid by the Labour Party and the ACTU to tell you that they're good. I can't tell you what to do. Thanks to John Howard and Kevin Rudd, your freedom to associate is protected. So that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you like this video and want to see more from me, make sure to subscribe to my channel, follow my Twitter, check out my other videos and all that sort of thing. If you want to support me financially so that I can survive in this hellish world of ours, you can become a patron on Patreon or send me a tip on Ko-fi. And a special thanks to all of my patrons for their support, and especially freelance policeman and Teja Simvik. Bye!